A junior lobbyist in Washington, D.C., plagued by guilt after his firm helped gut a consumer protection law in a deal championed by Lisa Murkowski, watched a news report on a Dallas family losing their home and decided to expose the entire strategy to Jasmine Crockett's office. The speech that followed didn't just fill the momentary void of the 24-hour news cycle. It detonated a fault line in the bedrock of Washington power. Before the C-SPAN cameras had even cut away from the House floor, clips were being sliced, captioned, and fired across social media. On cable news, anchors who had been preparing to discuss trade deficits were suddenly staring at their producers, demanding to know who had the playbook Crockett was referencing. Senator Murkowski's office, which had been confidently preparing for a weekend recess, was instantly besieged. The power of Crockett's move wasn't just in the accusation, it was in the receipt she presented, a document that transformed a political disagreement into a moral indictment that no one saw coming. The week began not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a television in a sterile Arlington apartment. Kaylin Vance, 28 years old, and already a vice president at a boutique K Street firm, was doing what he always did after work, decompressing with the national news while scrolling through internal memos on his tablet. He was good at his job. He knew how to take a client's objective, say, loosening the criteria for mortgage-backed securities held by regional banks, and transform it into a narrative of empowerment. He didn't see it as deception, he saw it as translation. He translated corporate interest into the language of the common good, economic freedom, unleashing local lenders, cutting bureaucratic red tape. He had been the lead architect on the messaging for the Financial Services Modernization Act, a dense piece of legislation that his firm had successfully ushered through Congress 6 months prior. His key target had been the moderates, the institutionalists, the senators, who could provide the crucial bipartisan cover. His masterpiece had been the briefing book for Senator Lisa Murkowski. He knew her record, her preference for data-driven, non-ideological arguments. He had crafted the perfect pitch, focusing on how the bill would help small, independent banks in places like Alaska compete with the national giants. It had worked flawlessly. The bill passed, his client was thrilled, and Kaylin received a significant bonus. He was sipping a glass of water when a local news segment from a Dallas affiliate came on the national broadcast. The Chiron read, "Family faces foreclosure after new law voids forbearance agreement." The camera focused on a man named Mateo de la Cruz, standing on his porch with his wife, Ilara, their faces etched with a weary disbelief. Their daughter, a little girl named Sophia, clung to her mother's leg, partially hidden from the camera. Mateo explained that he had lost his job at a local manufacturing plant and had worked out a forbearance plan with his bank, a regional lender based in Oklahoma. But after the new law passed, the bank suddenly changed its tune. They had sold his mortgage, and the new owner, a faceless investment entity, was using a clause buried deep in the new legislation to invalidate the old agreement. "They said the new rules are the new rules," Mateo said, his voice cracking. "They said the red tape was gone, but that red tape, that was our safety net. That was the promise they made to us." Kaylin felt a cold dread wash over him. Red tape, that was his phrase. He had written it on a whiteboard in a conference room 6 months ago. He had put it in the one-page summary he knew senators would read, instead of the 300-page bill. Here, he had drafted the op-ed for a banking executive that used the phrase 3 times. He was watching the direct, real-world consequence of his language. The De La Cruz family wasn't an abstraction. They were standing on a porch that looked a lot like his own parents' porch in Ohio. The little girl, Sophia, looked like his niece. The guilt was not a slow creep. It was a physical blow. He felt a tightness in his chest, a bitter taste in his mouth. He had known, abstractly, that the bill would make it easier for banks to offload risky loans and for the new owners to act aggressively. His firm had even flagged it as a potential public relations headwind, but they had neutralized it with more language, more talking points, more translations. For 2 days, Kaylin lived in a fog of self-recrimination. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of Ilara de la Cruz, trying to stay strong for her husband. At work, he sat in meetings about a new initiative for the pharmaceutical industry, and the words sounded like ash in his mouth. He saw the same process beginning again, the same cynical translation of profit into progress. He watched an interview with Senator Murkowski on a Sunday morning talk show. She was composed, reasonable, the very picture of the thoughtful legislator he had targeted. "Of course, no one wants to see any family struggle," she said calmly when the host brought up anecdotal reports of aggressive foreclosures. But the goal of the Financial Services Modernization Act was to cut red tape for small banks, to free them from burdensome regulations that only benefit the largest Wall Street institutions. Critics of this bill are either misunderstanding the legislative process or are intentionally trying to score political points. That was the moment Kalen Vance broke. It wasn't just his phrase. It was his entire strategy, delivered with senatorial gravitas. The dismissal of the victims as anecdotes. The pivot to attacking critics. It was all there. Straight from his playbook. He had not just given her the words. He had given her the shield to hide behind, as families like the De La Cruzes lost everything. That evening, he went back to his office, his stomach churning. He told the night security guard he'd forgotten a file. Inside, he walked to the secure archives. Using his credentials, he accessed the project folder for the bill. He didn't just print one memo. He printed everything. The initial strategy document, the target lists of staffers and members of Congress, the evolution of the messaging, the talking points, with specific notes on which arguments tested best with which political demographics. He printed the call sheets and the proposed op-eds. He even printed the internal emails where he and his team celebrated when Senator Murkowski used their exact phrasing in a committee hearing. He put it all into a thick accordion file, a comprehensive recipe book for how to gut a consumer protection law. He knew exactly who needed to see it. He had seen her on C-SPAN, a freshman congresswoman who still spoke with the clarity and fire of the public defender she used to be. She represented Dallas. She represented the De La Cruz family. Meanwhile, in her small office in the Cannon House office building, Jasmine Crockett was on the phone with her district director. They had been inundated with calls about the new foreclosure crisis. The De La Cruz case was just one of a dozen they were tracking. "It's a slaughter, Jasmine," her director said. "This law is a loaded gun, and these investment groups are just walking down the street pulling the trigger." Crockett felt a familiar burn of anger. This was why she'd left the courtroom for Congress. It was the same fight, just with different rules. In court, you had discovery. You could demand documents. You could expose the truth. Here, the truth was buried under mountains of procedure and protected by privilege. She was scheduled to give a 5-minute speech on the House floor during a debate on a new, unrelated financial regulation bill. She was planning to talk about the need for stronger oversight, to use the De La Cruz family as an example. It felt inadequate. It felt like bringing a strongly worded letter to a gunfight. After hanging up, her chief of staff, a sharp, perpetually stressed woman named Anya Sharma, knocked on her open door. "Weird one for you," Anya said. A guy came by the front desk. Wouldn't give his name. Said he was a lobbyist. He looked like he was going to be sick. He just handed this to the intern and said, "Give this to the congresswoman. She'll know what to do with it." Then he basically ran out of the building. Anya placed a thick, heavy accordion file on Crockett's desk. Crockett looked at it, intrigued. She undid the elastic clasp and opened it. The first page was a title sheet. Project Nightingale, Strategic Communications Plan for the Financial Services Modernization Act. For the next hour, Jasmine Crockett sat in silence, reading. Anya watched as the congresswoman's expression shifted from curiosity to focused intensity, and then to a cold, hard fury. Crockett didn't just skim. As a lawyer, she absorbed every detail, every nuance. She saw the cynical architecture of the entire campaign, the list of persuadable journalists, the pre-written letters to the editor for concerned citizens, and there it was, in a section titled Key Stakeholder Engagement, Senate Moderates, a detailed profile of Lisa Murkowski. It analyzed her voting record, her public statements, even her preferred style of briefing. Next to it was the messaging framework designed specifically for her. At the top of the page, underlined, was the phrase, "Primary narrative. Cutting red tape for Main Street banks versus Wall Street." Crockett pushed the file away and looked at Anya. "Get me the transcript of Senator Murkowski's interview from Sunday," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Anya pulled it up on her tablet and handed it over. Crockett read Murkowski's words, then looked back at the document. They were nearly identical. It wasn't just an echo. It was a recitation. This wasn't politics. It was a script. And she was holding the stage directions. "Cancel my talking points for the floor speech," Crockett said, standing up. "I've got something new." She picked up the file. She wasn't bringing a letter to a gunfight anymore. She was bringing the opposition's battle plans. The House floor was, as is often the case for evening speeches, sparsely populated. A handful of members milled about, chatting with colleagues. The press gallery above was mostly empty, save for a few diligent junior reporters and CSPAN's unblinking cameras. The presiding officer droned on, recognizing members for 5-minute blocks. When it was her turn, Jasmine Crockett walked to the lectern in the well of the House. She placed a single thick folder on the wooden surface. She didn't look up at the gallery or at the speaker's chair. She looked directly into the main camera, as if she were speaking to one person. "Mr. Speaker," she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the chamber's microphone system. "I rise today to speak about a family in my district in Dallas. Their names are Mateo and Elara de la Cruz. They have a young daughter named Sofia. Until recently, they had a home. They had a promise from their bank, and they had a belief that the rules, even when they are hard, are at least fair." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. A few of the members who had been chatting stopped and turned to look at her. It was an old trial lawyer's trick. Start with a story, not an argument. Make it human. "Mateo lost his job," she continued. "But he did what you're supposed to do. He didn't hide. He went to his bank, and he made a deal. They would be patient. He would get back on his feet. The bank agreed. That was the rule. That was the promise. But 6 months ago, this body, along with the other chamber, passed a law. A law that was sold to the American people as a way to help small banks, as a way to cut red tape. And suddenly, the promise made to the De La Cruz family was worthless. Their mortgage was sold, and their new lender is using this new law to throw them out of their home. Their lives are being destroyed by a law that was passed in their name, but not for their benefit." She looked down at the folder, then back at the cameras. "I hear a lot of talk in these halls about policy, about legislative process. I heard a distinguished senator from Alaska on television just this past weekend, talking about this very law. She said its critics were misunderstanding the legislative process, or trying to score political points. She was very confident, very knowledgeable. She spoke about the importance of cutting red tape for small banks. It was a very persuasive performance. Now she had the attention of everyone in the chamber. The cadence of her speech had shifted. The quiet storyteller was gone, replaced by the prosecutor. "The reason it was so persuasive," Crockett said, tapping the folder with her index finger, "is that it was rehearsed. The reason it sounded so polished is because it was written for her. The reason she was so confident is that she was following a script. A script written by lobbyists on K Street to sell a law that is devastating families in my district and across this country." A murmur went through the chamber. In the press gallery, a reporter who had been half asleep sat bolt upright and started typing furiously on his phone. "I have here," Crockett said, opening the accordion file, "a document. It's a playbook. It's called Project Nightingale, and it is a step-by-step guide on how to fool the American people, how to take a law that benefits a few powerful clients and dress it up as a win for Main Street. I want to read you some of the chapter titles in this playbook." She pulled out a single sheet of paper. Step 1. Narrative framing. Rebrand consumer protections as job-killing bureaucracy. 2. Targeted outreach. Identify and leverage moderate members vulnerable to small versus big messaging. Step 3. Public-facing validation. Draft and place op-eds and letters to the editor from concerned local business leaders. She let each title land. This was no longer a general accusation. It was specific. It was documented. Let's go to step 2, shall we? This playbook includes detailed profiles on how to approach certain members. For one senator, the senior senator from Alaska, it advises, avoid complex financial arguments. Focus on the narrative of Alaskan independence and resentment towards national banking conglomerates. It then provides a list of talking points. I wonder if any of these sound familiar. She held the paper up. Talking point 1. This is about cutting red tape. Talk. Talking point 2. We are freeing local lenders from burdensome regulations. Talking point 3. This empowers our communities to make their own financial decisions without Washington, D.C. micromanaging them. Talking point 4. The opposition to this bill is coming from those who don't understand the unique needs of states like ours. She put the paper down and folded her hands on the lectern. It's all here. The exact words. The entire strategy. The cynical game, where you write the lines, you hand them to politicians, and you watch as they perform their parts. And while this performance is happening, the people we are all sworn to represent, people like the De La Cruz family, are the ones who pay the price. They lose their homes. They lose their faith. They lose everything. She took a breath, her eyes blazing with a controlled fire. This isn't a misunderstanding of the legislative process. This is a perversion of it. And I did not learn about this from a disgruntled staffer or a rival political party. Here came the final, killing blow. A young man came to my office drowning in guilt because he saw how the sausage was made. He saw the news report about the family in my district. And he couldn't live with himself. He couldn't square the talking points he wrote with the wreckage he saw on his television screen. He saw that the red tape Senator Murkowski cut was the only thing protecting my constituents from losing everything. She looked across the floor at the handful of stunned faces staring back at her. So my question for my colleagues, for the members of the press, and for the American people is this. How many more playbooks are out there? How many of our laws are not the product of debate, but the product of a script? And when will we decide that the testimony of a family on the verge of homelessness is more important than the talking points of a lobbyist who writes our laws for us? She gathered her papers, closed the file, and held it up one last time. Because this, she said, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, this is evidence. This is a confession. And the guilt that brought this into the light should be a wake-up call for every single person in this building. She yielded the balance of her time. As she walked away from the lectern, the chamber was utterly silent. The low hum of the C-SPAN cameras seemed deafening. Then, the phones in the press gallery started ringing, one after another, a cascade of electronic noise breaking the spell. The story was out. The bomb had gone off. As Jasmine Crockett stepped off the House floor and into the marble hallway, the silence of the chamber was replaced by the frantic buzzing of the phone in her hand. It felt like a live thing, vibrating with a furious energy. Her chief of staff, Anya, met her just outside the doors, her own phone pressed to her ear, her eyes wide. Every network, Jasmine. Every single one, Anya mouthed, holding up a hand to the person on the other end of her call. No, she will not be making a statement right now. Thank you. She hung up, her gaze fixed on Crockett. What have you done? She whispered, a sentiment that was equal parts awe and terror. A few colleagues hurried past, their gazes fixedly on the floor, pointedly avoiding eye contact, as if proximity to Crockett might be contagious. But then, an older congressman from a neighboring state, a man she barely knew, who was famous for his quiet, behind-the-scenes work on agricultural policy, slowed as he passed. He didn't stop, but he caught her eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a small gesture, but in the charged atmosphere of that hallway, it felt like a profound statement of solidarity. The message was clear. You are not alone. The story didn't just break. It shattered the existing news landscape. On one major cable network, a panel that had been heatedly debating foreign policy suddenly fell silent as the anchor cut in. "We are interrupting this program with breaking news from Capitol Hill," he announced, his voice tight with excitement. Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas has just concluded a speech on the House floor in which she alleges, with what she claims is documentary evidence, that a major piece of financial legislation was crafted not by lawmakers, but by K Street lobbyists. She directly implicated the senior senator from Alaska, Lisa Murkowski, in this scheme. The screen behind him split, showing Crockett's fiery speech on one side and a file photo of a smiling, professional Lisa Murkowski on the other. The visual contrast was jarring and irresistible. Within an hour, Project Nightingale and the Playbook were the top trending topics on every social media platform. Political pundits, caught completely flat-footed, struggled to analyze the situation. Some accused Crockett of a shocking breach of decorum, a theatrical stunt unbecoming of a member of Congress. Others hailed her as a hero, a truth-teller, who had dared to pull back the curtain on a corrupt system. But they were all forced to orbit around the central, undeniable fact: the folder, the documents. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was an accusation backed by evidence that Crockett had promised to make public. Across town, in her Russell Senate office building suite, Lisa Murkowski was going over casework with the legislative assistant when her chief of staff, a seasoned D.C. veteran named Garrett Thorne, burst into her office without knocking. He was pale, his tie was slightly askew, and he was holding his tablet like a shield. "Senator, you need to see this. Right now." He didn't need to say anything else. Murkowski knew from his expression that it was a 5-alarm fire. He wordlessly tapped the screen, and the video of Crockett's speech began to play. Murkowski listened, her expression transitioning from confusion to disbelief, and then to a slow-burning, glacial fury. She was a senator who prided herself on her diligence, her independence, her deep understanding of policy. She had read the summaries, sat through the briefings, and genuinely believed the Financial Services Modernization Act was a net positive for her state's small, community-focused banks that were being squeezed by giants like Bank of America. She remembered the arguments about cutting red tape. They had made sense to her. They still did. To hear this freshman congresswoman, a progressive firebrand from Texas, accuse her of being a puppet, of reading lines fed to her by a lobbyist, was more than a political attack. It was a deep, personal insult. It struck at the very heart of her identity as a legislator. "Who is Jasmine Crockett?" she asked, her voice dangerously low, when the video ended. Garrett, already typing on his phone, didn't look up. "Freshman, from Dallas. She's on oversight, known for viral clips questioning witnesses. A real bomb thrower." "Get me everything on her," Murkowski commanded. "And get me our files on that bill. I want to see the briefing materials we got. I want to see who we met with. Everything." Her team scrambled. The phones were already ringing off the hook. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox News. They all wanted a comment. "What do we say, Senator?" Garrett asked. Murkowski stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the Capitol complex. "Our first response is no comment," she said, her back to the room. "We will not be goaded into a response by theatrics or a second response. An hour from now will be a written statement. It will say that we are dismayed by the baseless and personal nature of the attack, that the legislation was the product of a thorough and bipartisan process, and that we will not dignify unsubstantiated allegations with further comment." It was a classic, by-the-book crisis response. But Murkowski knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that this was not a by-the-book crisis. The accusation wasn't that she had supported a bad bill. The accusation was that she hadn't even been the author of her own support. It was an attack on her agency, her very integrity. And she had no idea if the documents Crockett was holding were real. In his Arlington apartment, Kalen Vance felt like the walls were closing in. He had watched the speech live on his laptop, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the folder, his folder. He heard his words, his strategy, dissected on the floor of the United States Congress. A wave of vertigo washed over him. a dizzying mix of abject terror and profound, cleansing relief. The secret was out. The guilt that had been eating him alive was now public property. But so was his career, his future, everything he had worked for. His phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of his firm's managing partner, a man whose name was on the door. Kalen's hand trembled as he answered. "Hello?" he managed to say, his voice a dry croak. The voice on the other end was cold steel. "Kalen, did you do it?" There was no point in lying. His keycard had been used to access the archives. The timestamps would prove it. "Yes," he said softly. There was a moment of dead silence. "You are fired, effective immediately," the partner said. "Your access has been revoked. A courier is on the way to your apartment to collect all company property. Do not speak to anyone. Do not contact any of our clients. A lawyer from the firm will be in touch with you tomorrow to discuss the extent of the damages you have caused. You have destroyed this firm's reputation, Kalen, and we will not forget it." The line went dead. Kalen dropped the phone onto his couch. Fired. Sued. Blacklisted. He walked to his window and looked out at the distant lights of the Washington Monument. He had known this would happen. He had played it out in his mind 100 times, but the reality of it was crushing. He was completely, utterly alone. He had detonated a bomb in the middle of his own life, and now he was standing in the crater, the smoke clearing to reveal nothing but ruins. The guilt was gone, but in its place was a fear so vast and empty it threatened to swallow him whole. Hours later, long after midnight, Jasmine Crockett was finally back in her own quiet apartment. Anya had practically forced her to leave the office, where the phones were still ringing. The adrenaline from the speech had long since faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She kicked off her shoes and sank into the couch, scrolling through the news on her phone. Her face was everywhere. The clip of her speech was everywhere. She read the analysis, the praise, the vitriolic attacks. The official email inbox for her office had crashed, but her personal accounts were a raging river of messages. Hundreds of messages of support from people all over the country, thanking her for her courage. And the threats. Vile, graphic threats that made her stomach clench. They called her every name imaginable. They threatened her family. They promised violence. She had been a public defender. She had dealt with angry people, with dangerous people, but this was different. This was a faceless, digital mob, a tidal wave of hatred directed at her for speaking a truth they didn't want to hear. She felt a tremor of fear, not for herself, but for the precedent it set. Was this the cost of telling the truth now? A level of vitriol that made you question whether it was worth it? The phone in her hand buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a notification. It was a call. The screen read, "Mom." With a deep breath she answered, preparing herself for the conversation she knew she had to have. The one where she had to convince the person who loved her most in the world not to worry. Even as a cold knot of anxiety tightened in her own chest, the fight was just beginning, and she was already feeling its weight. "Hey, Mom," Jasmine said, trying to inject a note of casual normalcy into her voice that she did not feel. "Jasmine Felicia Crockett, don't you hey mom me?" came the voice through the speaker, a familiar blend of maternal pride and profound worry. Her mother, a retired teacher who had raised 2 children on her own, had a sixth sense for trouble. "I saw you on the news. The real news, not just that cable chatter. They broke into the evening news for you. You look tired." "It's been a long day," Jasmine understated, sinking deeper into the couch cushions. "You poked the bear, baby," her mother said, her voice softening. "A big, powerful bear. I am so proud of you I could burst. You stood up there and you spoke the truth, just like your father would have. But I'm scared. I saw those things people are writing online. Your sister sent me some of it, told me I shouldn't look, so of course I did." Jasmine closed her eyes. "Mom, please don't read that stuff. It's just noise. It's what they do when they can't fight the facts." "It's not just noise, Jasmine. It's poison. These people are not playing by the rules." You went after not just the politician, but the money behind the politician. That's a different kind of fight. Are you being careful? Are you watching who's around you? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears of what could happen to a black woman who made powerful people angry. I'm being careful, Jasmine reassured her, though the security briefing she knew was coming would make that danger all too real. I have good people around me. Anya is a rock. And it had to be done, Mom. I saw that family's faces. It was the same look I saw on people's faces when they came to me at the public defender's office. The look of someone who the system was built to crush. I couldn't just let that go. I know, her mother sighed, a sound of resignation and understanding. I know you couldn't. It's why they sent you there. Just call me every day, even if it's just for a minute, so I know you're all right. I promise, Jasmine said. I love you. I love you more. Now get some sleep. You've got more fighting to do tomorrow. The next morning, Kalen Vance was startled by a sharp, authoritative knock on his apartment door. He wasn't expecting the promised courier. He was expecting a lawyer. And the man standing in his hallway certainly looked the part. He was in his late 50s, with perfectly coiffed silver hair, and a suit that probably cost more than Kalen's first car. He introduced himself as Arthur Finch, senior counsel for Kalen's now former firm. He didn't offer a handshake. May I come in? Finch asked, though it was phrased as a statement. Kalen numbly stepped aside. Finch walked into the small living room, his eyes scanning the space with unconcealed disdain before settling on Kalen. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Mr. Vance, Finch began, placing a slim leather briefcase on the coffee table. You have committed an act of industrial espionage. You have violated at least 3 separate clauses of your employment contract, including a non-disclosure agreement that carries severe financial penalties. You have stolen proprietary information, intellectual property, that is the sole asset of our firm. The damages are, to put it mildly, catastrophic. Health you. Kalen felt his throat tighten. The document. Do not speak, Finch commanded, holding up a hand. I am not here to debate or listen to your justifications. I am here to inform you of the consequences. The firm is preparing a civil suit against you. We will be seeking damages in the 8-figure range for loss of business, reputational harm, and breach of contract. We will garnish your wages for the rest of your life. We will seize any and all assets. You will never work in this town or any other again. Each word was a hammer blow. Kalen sank onto his couch, feeling dizzy. Finch wasn't finished. Furthermore, we are in discussions with the U.S. Attorney's Office. While the firm would prefer to handle this civilly, the theft of trade secrets is a federal crime. A conviction carries a potential prison sentence of up to 10 years. Your cooperation, going forward, will be a significant factor in whether we recommend the government pursue criminal charges. Cooperation? Kalen whispered. You will sign a sworn affidavit, Finch said, snapping open his briefcase and producing a sheaf of papers. It will state that you acted alone, that you were suffering from severe emotional distress, and that the documents you stole were preliminary drafts and strategic thought experiments, not an accurate reflection of the firm's final work or the legislative process. You will state that you misled Representative Crockett's office as to the nature of the documents. It was a trap. They wanted him to publicly discredit the very evidence he had leaked, to kneecap Crockett's case, and turn himself into an unreliable, emotionally unstable witness. They were offering him a way out of prison, but the price was his integrity, the very thing he had sought to reclaim. You want me to lie? Kalen said, a flicker of defiance cutting through his fear. Finch smiled, a cold, reptilian expression. I want you to sign a document that accurately reflects your compromised state of mind. Your alternative is to face the full and undivided legal force of a firm you have grievously wronged, both civilly and criminally. You cannot afford a lawyer, Mr. Vance. We have a floor full of them. Think very carefully about your next move. He placed the affidavit on the coffee table next to a gold-plated fountain pen. You have 24 hours to sign and return this to my office. I trust you'll make the prudent choice. With that, Arthur Finch stood, straightened his jacket, and left, leaving Kaylin alone with the smell of expensive cologne and the terrifying weight of an impossible decision. In Senator Murkowski's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The no-comment strategy had collapsed under the relentless media pressure. Every news outlet was running the story. And the key question was no longer if Murkowski had been influenced, but how she would respond to the proof. Garrett Thorne stood before her desk, looking haggard. "They're calling it playbook gate," he said, running a hand through his already messy hair. "Crockett's office hasn't released the full document yet, but they're threatening to. The narrative is setting in stone that you were a dupe." "I was not a dupe," Murkowski snapped, her voice sharp. She had been up all night, going through her own team's files from the bill. The truth was messy. She recognized some of the phrasing from the lobbyists' briefing materials. It was standard practice. Lobbyists from every industry, oil, fishing, environmental groups, unions, all provided talking points. It was a form of professional shorthand in a town where no one had time to become an expert on everything. You took the information, you weighed it against your own judgment and the needs of your state, and you made a decision. She had genuinely believed she was helping Alaska. "The problem, Senator," Garrett said carefully, "is that it doesn't matter what we believe. It matters what Crockett can prove. And she's framing this as a conspiracy. We need to change the subject. We need to go on the offensive." "Against who, Crockett? It will look like I'm trying to silence her. Against the lobbyist? We don't even know who it is." "We go after the act itself," Garrett countered, leaning forward. "We make this about process and precedent. Crockett is championing a disgruntled employee who stole proprietary documents from his employer. She's holding up a criminal act as a civic virtue. What's the chilling effect of that? Will staffers feel they can no longer have frank discussions? Will outside groups feel they can't provide honest counsel for fear of some junior analyst leaking their notes? We make this about the integrity of the legislative process." Murkowski considered it. It was a clever pivot. It shifted the terrain from her own credibility to Crockett's methods. It would appeal to the institutionalists in both parties, who were uncomfortable with this kind of raw, disruptive tactic. "All right," she said, nodding slowly. "Draft a statement and book me an interview. Not with a friendly face. Someone who will be seen as neutral. I want to make the case myself. This can't be about partisan politics. This has to be about how we conduct the people's business. We will frame this as a dangerous new precedent that threatens the very foundation of how this government functions." She was fighting back, not by denying the facts, but by reframing their meaning. It was a gamble, but it was the only move she had left. The next few days in Jasmine Crockett's office were a blur of managed chaos. The death threats had triggered a mandatory security review by the Capitol Police. An officer, with a grim, serious face, sat down with her and Anya, outlining new protocols, telling them not to open packages, to be aware of their surroundings, to report any suspicious activity. The reality of the danger settled heavily in the small office. Her staff, a team of mostly young, idealistic legislative aides, were working around the clock. They were fielding calls from enraged constituents who believed the lies being spread about her, and from grateful ones who saw her as their champion. They were trying to do their actual jobs, casework, policy research, while a political firestorm raged around them. "We have to release the playbook," Anya argued during a late-night strategy session, pointing to a stack of printouts of news articles. "Murkowski is gaining traction with this chilling effect argument. The longer we hold it, the more it looks like we're hiding something. We need to show them the whole, ugly truth." Jasmine shook her head. "We can't. Not yet." She was thinking of Kalen Vance. She had never met him, never spoken to him. He was just a ghost who had left a folder. But she felt a profound sense of duty to him. He had risked everything, and the playbook was full of his digital fingerprints, metadata, internal email chains, draft notes. Releasing it in its entirety would be tantamount to handing him over to his old firm's lawyers on a silver platter. "He knew the risks," Anya pressed gently. "And he trusted me to be strategic," Crockett countered. "He didn't give that file to a journalist. He gave it to a lawyer, a congresswoman, who represents the very people his work harmed." That was a deliberate choice. We can't protect him completely, but we can't be the ones to serve him up. She made a decision. We'll release parts of it. We'll redact anything that could identify the source. We'll release the section on media manipulation. We'll release the part that details the strategy for creating fake grassroots support. We give them enough to prove our case beyond a shadow of a doubt, but we hold back the parts that would definitively burn our source. We fight this on our terms, not theirs. It was a calculated risk. It would keep the story alive and counter Murkowski's pivot. But it would also invite accusations that she was cherry-picking the evidence. It was an imperfect solution, but it was one that balanced the political necessity of the fight with the moral duty to the man who had started it. The weight of that decision, of all the decisions, was immense. The fight was far from over. It was just getting more complicated. The release of the redacted playbook sections ignited a fresh wave of media hysteria. For 2 days, cable news panels debated the significance of the heavily blacked-out pages. Jasmine Crockett supporters pointed to the revealed portions as undeniable proof of a conspiracy. The detailed plans for creating fake grassroots campaigns and the cynical strategies for manipulating media narratives were laid bare. Her detractors, however, seized on the redactions themselves as proof of duplicity. "What is she hiding?" became the new talking point. If the evidence is so damning, why not show us all of it? Senator Murkowski's strategy, bolstered by this new line of attack, was proving effective at muddying the waters. In an interview with a respected national news anchor, she was calm and resolute. "I am not going to debate the contents of a stolen, cherry-picked document," she stated, looking directly into the camera. "The larger issue here is the precedent being set. Representative Crockett is glorifying an illegal act. Are we now saying that any disgruntled employee can steal internal documents and be hailed as a hero? That will have a profoundly chilling effect on the ability of lawmakers to receive candid advice. That is the threat to our democracy we should be discussing." The political world settled into a grim stalemate. The story was devolving into a predictable partisan brawl. Exactly what Crockett had feared and what Murkowski's team had engineered. The core issue, the systemic corruption, was getting lost in the noise. And then, from the unlikeliest of corners, came the intervention that changed everything. Professor Julian Croft was a towering figure in conservative legal circles, a scholar at Yale Law School. His writings on constitutional law and free market principles were required reading for a generation of conservative lawyers and judges. He was a staunch advocate for deregulation and a frequent, eloquent critic of the progressive agenda. He was, by all accounts, the last person on earth expected to ride to the rescue of Jasmine Crockett. His op-ed appeared on a Thursday morning in the Wall Street Journal, under the headline, "A System in Contempt of Itself." It landed with the force of a thunderclap. "I have spent the better part of my career arguing for a reduction in the regulatory state," Croft began. "It is a position from which I have not deviated. It is therefore with some surprise that I find myself compelled to defend the actions of Representative Jasmine Crockett, a politician with whom I share virtually no common ground on matters of policy. Yet the firestorm she has ignited is not, at its heart, a matter of policy. It is a matter of process, and of the fundamental integrity of our Republican form of government. The piece was methodical, dispassionate, and utterly devastating. The documents in question, the so-called playbook, are being debated as a political tool," he wrote. "This is a category error. They are not a tool, they are a symptom of a deep-seated disease. The business of lobbying has always been a part of our system. But what Project Nightingale describes is not lobbying, it is the systematic replacement of independent legislative deliberation with pre-packaged, market-tested corporate strategy. It is the manufacturing of consent on an industrial scale." Senator Murkowski, for whom I have generally held a high regard, argues that exposing this practice will have a chilling effect on governance. She is tragically mistaken. The chill we should truly fear is the one that has already descended upon a system where lawmakers, regardless of party, become mere conduits for language and strategies crafted in corporate boardrooms. The chill we should fear is a process so hollowed out that a legislator's own words are not their own. Representative Crockett did not attack a person. She exposed a rot. Her methods may have been explosive, but the sickness she revealed is quiet, pervasive, and far more dangerous to the health of the Republic than the leaking of any single document. The op-ed blew the political stalemate to pieces. It was no longer a story of Crockett versus Murkowski, Democrat versus Republican. Professor Croft, with his unimpeachable conservative credentials, had reframed the entire debate. He had given permission for Republicans and independents to be critical of the process without feeling like they were betraying their side. News anchors who had been content to host partisan food fights were now forced to discuss the deeper, systemic issues Croft had raised. The effect on Lisa Murkowski's position was immediate and brutal. The wall of support she had carefully constructed began to crumble. Garrett Thorne walked into her office late that Friday afternoon with a grim look on his face. "Senator, I just got off the phone with Senator Thompson's office," he said, referring to a key Republican colleague who had been publicly defending her. "He's pulling out of his Sunday show appearance. His staff said he's uncomfortable with the direction the story has taken since the Croft piece. He's not going to attack you, but he's no longer willing to defend you." Murkowski sank into her chair. It was a major defection. Thompson wasn't just an ally. He was a bellwether for the party's establishment wing. His silence was louder than any criticism. She was becoming an island. Her arguments about process drowned out by a rising tide of concern about the system itself. For the first time, she felt truly isolated, the political ground shifting beneath her feet. A week later, Jasmine Crockett walked onto the stage of the auditorium at a community college in the heart of her Dallas district. The room was packed, a vibrant cross-section of her constituency. There were black, white, and Latino faces, young students and older retirees, people in suits, and people in work shirts. The National Press Corps was crammed into a roped-off section at the back, their cameras trained on the stage. This was her arena, far from the marble halls and whispered arguments of Washington. She had asked the De La Cruz family to attend. They sat in the front row, looking nervous but resolute. Mateo, Alara, and little Sophia. Crockett had made it clear they would not have to speak. Their presence was statement enough. Crockett stepped to the podium, and the room fell silent. She did not begin with an attack. She began with gratitude. "Thank you all for being here," she started, her voice warm and steady. "It's good to be home." She spoke about the events of the past few weeks, not as a victory lap, but as a difficult but necessary journey. Then she addressed the intervention that had changed everything. A brilliant legal scholar, Professor Julian Croft, wrote a piece last week. He and I would probably disagree on how to solve most of the world's problems, but he looked at this situation, and he saw not a partisan fight, but a fundamental threat to the American idea. He argued that our government is weakened, not when we argue, but when we stop thinking for ourselves, when the arguments themselves are scripted by the highest bidder. And he was right. She paused, looking out over the crowd, her gaze eventually resting on the De La Cruz family. This fight was never about one law or one senator. It was about a question that gets to the very heart of who we are as a country. Are the doors of this government open to the people who live on Main Street, or are they only open to the people who can afford to write the rules on K Street? We were told that the rules needed to be changed to cut red tape, but when we looked closer, we found that the red tape being cut was the very thread that was holding families like the De La Cruzes in their homes. It was a safety net, a promise, and it was sold for the price of a lobbying contract. This was the climax, the distillation of her entire fight. She wasn't just a politician settling a score. She was a former public defender making her closing argument to the ultimate jury. The playbook that started all this was brought to me by someone who felt a crisis of conscience. And I want to talk about the guilt that he felt, because that guilt is a symptom of a system that too often asks good people to do bad things to get ahead. It asks them to sand down their morals, to translate their language into something it's not, to sell a product they know is flawed. That guilt is a warning light on our nation's dashboard. It's telling us that a critical system is failing. So the question is not how we punish one person. The question is how we fix the system. It's about restoring the idea that a person's voice matters more than the size of their wallet. It's about ensuring that the person you elect is the person who shows up to work, not a stand-in reading from someone else's script. That is the principle we have to fight for now. Not just in this instance, but every single day. She looked at Mateo and Alara de la Cruz, and then back at the crowd. This is not the end of the fight. This is the beginning. Thank you. The auditorium erupted in a wave of thunderous applause and a standing ovation that went on for several minutes. It was not just applause for a political victory. It was an affirmation of a principle, a release of frustration, and a surge of hope. Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, not as a congresswoman from Washington, but as a lawyer from Dallas who had just reminded her community and the nation what the fight was truly about. The month following Jasmine Crockett's town hall was not one of quiet victory, but of a slow, grinding shift in the political landscape. The echoes of her speech and Professor Croft's op-ed continued to reverberate, not just in the loud halls of Congress, but in the quiet offices where the daily work of government is done. It was in one of those offices that the most meaningful consequence took root. Amelia Hayes worked as a legislative aide for a moderate Republican congressman from a suburban district in Pennsylvania. She was 25, smart, and deeply disillusioned. She had come to Washington believing in public service, but her days consisted of answering phones, scheduling meetings, and summarizing briefing packets from lobbyists into neat, bite-sized memos for her boss. She felt less like a participant in democracy and more like a secretary for special interests. She had followed the playbook Gates saga with the jaded eye of a junior staffer. She had seen Crockett's speech and thought it was great political theater. She'd seen Murkowski's defense and recognized the practiced spin. To her, it was just another day in the swamp. Professor Croft's op-ed, however, had shaken her out of her cynicism. It gave a name to the vague unease she felt every day. It wasn't just that the system was transactional. It was that it was hollow. The piece articulated that the real danger wasn't disagreement, but the absence of authentic thought. It made her feel complicit. A few days after the town hall, her boss was preparing for a committee hearing on a complex environmental bill related to energy exploration. As expected, a lobbyist from a massive energy conglomerate, a polished man with an expensive suit and an easy smile, dropped off a comprehensive briefing packet. The task fell to Amelia to summarize it. As she opened the glossy folder, a feeling of déjà vu washed over her. The language was slick and reassuring. It was filled with focus group tested phrases like responsible stewardship, common sense energy solutions, and streamlining cumbersome environmental reviews. It was a playbook. It even had a catchy, innocuous name, the Clear Horizon Initiative. A month ago, Amelia would have sighed, opened a new document, and begun translating the corporate jargon into a simple, one-page memo that highlighted the pro-business and pro-growth aspects she knew her boss would want to see. She would have ignored the gnawing feeling in her gut. But this time was different. She thought of Jasmine Crockett holding up that folder. She thought of Professor Croft's words about the chill that descends when representatives cease to be authors of their own arguments. That evening, long after her colleagues had left, Amelia stayed at her desk. She typed up the standard, perfunctory summary she was expected to produce. Then, she opened a new, blank document. She spent the next 3 hours doing the job she had always thought she was supposed to do. She went online, not to the energy company's website, but to the archives of scientific journals and the reports from the Environmental Protection Agency. She cross-referenced the lobbyists' claims, one by one. The streamlining of reviews, she discovered, involved eliminating a mandatory study on the impact of water table contamination. The common-sense solutions included loopholes that would allow for the release of methane gas at levels far exceeding current standards. She compiled her findings into a second memo, this one marked confidential, for your eyes only. It was professional, dispassionate, and meticulously sourced. She didn't use inflammatory language or make accusations. She simply laid out the facts, contrasting the lobbyists' claims with the scientific data. At the very end, she added a single paragraph. "Sir," she wrote, "I took the liberty of doing a deeper dive on this, as the language in the briefing packet was remarkably similar to the public relations materials released by the company last quarter. In light of the recent public discussion surrounding Project Nightingale, I felt it was my duty to ensure you had a full and independent analysis of the bill's potential impact on the district, beyond the provided talking points. The data from the EPA suggests the environmental risks are significant. She printed the memo, her hand shaking slightly as she placed it in a sealed envelope. She walked to her boss's private office and slipped it under his door. Walking back to her desk, she felt a fear she had never known in her professional life. But it was overshadowed by a feeling she had almost forgotten, a sense of purpose. She had not leaked a document. She had not started a firestorm. She had simply done her job with integrity. It was a quiet, unseen act of rebellion against the hollowing out of the system. It was the lasting echo of Jasmine Crockett's stand. In Dallas, the De La Cruz family received a call from the Legal Aid Society that had taken their case. The intense public and political pressure had forced a top-to-bottom review of the mortgages affected by the Financial Services Modernization Act. The lawyers had found a critical error in the securitization process of their specific loan. The foreclosure was halted, subject to a legal challenge that, the lawyer explained cheerfully, the new owners of the loan would almost certainly not want to fight in open court. The family would be able to keep their home. When Mateo de la Cruz called Jasmine Crockett's district office to share the news, his voice was thick, with an emotion that the staffer on the other end of the line could feel through the phone. It was the sound of a weight being lifted, the sound of a promise kept. For Kaylin Vance, the path forward remained uncertain, but it was no longer shrouded in darkness. Professor Croft's op-ed had made it politically toxic for his former firm to be seen persecuting a whistleblower. The threats of criminal charges evaporated. The civil suit was still pending, but a prominent D.C. lawyer who specialized in First Amendment cases and had been moved by Kaylin's story had agreed to represent him pro bono. One afternoon, sitting in a coffee shop far from K Street, Kaylin opened his laptop. He deleted his old resume, a monument to his skill at translating corporate will into political action. He started a new one from scratch. At the top, under Objective, he wrote, "To use my knowledge of strategic communications and the legislative process to advocate for consumer rights and systemic transparency." His career. But he was slowly finding his way back to himself. And in Alaska, Senator Lisa Murkowski stood before a room of local reporters in Anchorage. She looked tired, but resolute. The firestorm had singed her, damaging her carefully cultivated brand as an independent thinker above the political fray. She would survive, but she was changed. She did not apologize. Instead, she announced the formation of a new bipartisan Senate working group. The events of the past month have made it clear that we must have a serious conversation about the rules that govern the intersection of private advocacy and public service, she said, her voice even. "I am therefore forming an exploratory committee to review the nexus of lobbying and the legislative process, with the goal of drafting legislation to ensure greater transparency and accountability for all involved." It was a masterful political pivot, a way of getting in front of a problem she had been accused of ignoring. But it was also a concession. It was an admission, however tacit, that Jasmine Crockett had been right about one thing. The system was broken. The story of Playbook Gate eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by the next crisis, the next outrage. But the lasting echo wasn't in the news cycle. It was in the quiet decision of an aide like Amelia Hayes to do the harder, better work. It was in the legal precedent that gave a family like the De La Cruzes a fighting chance. It was in a young man like Kaylin Vance choosing to rebuild his life around principle instead of profit. And it was in the slow, almost imperceptible shift in Washington, a new awareness that even the most carefully crafted playbook can be undone by a single act of conscience and a single voice brave enough to tell its story. What do you think is more powerful? A loud, public confrontation that exposes a problem, or the quiet, internal acts of integrity that work to fix it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for more stories that go beyond the headlines, don't forget to subscribe.